Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the SULPITER project, we would like to thank you for joining this webinar, this training event. My name is Giuseppe Lupino, and together with my colleague Eleonora Tu, we are going to be hosting this webinar. SULPITER is a project co-funded by the European Union through the Central Europe program, deals with sustainable urban logistic plan in functional urban areas. It has been running for about a year and a half now, and it is led by the Institute for Transport and Logistics, based in Bologna, which I represent. Our partner, ILIM, based in Poland, has kindly provided the webinar platform. This webinar is part of a big process to enhancing understanding, participation, and planning within functional urban areas and cities in general. Capacity building is very important to guide authorities in their policy decisions. We have two solutions for guiding authorities in their policy decisions. The first is related to the understanding of urban freight behaviors in each functional urban area with technical analysis. The second is training. There are going to be a total of 6 webinars in specific topics and related to the Sustainable Urban Logistic Plan development. Please check our website for more information. Today, we are going to learn about how to set up and organize a freight quality partnership. In general, described as a group of transport operators and local authorities that come together to deal with matters of freight access and deliveries in a particular location. I'm glad to have as a speaker Professor Michael Browne from the University of Gothenburg. No need to introduce him, but just for some few words about Mike. His main research focus is on urban goods transport. It provides academic leadership for the Urban Freight Platform, which is a joint initiative between the University of Gothenburg and Chalmers, which is supported by the Volvo Research and Educational Foundation. Prior to moving to Gothenburg, Professor Browne worked for about 20 years at the University of Westminster and continues to chair the Central London Freight Quality Partnership. We are very glad to have him today. Before leaving the floor to Professor Browne, I would like to tell you about the format of this webinar. Professor Browne's presentation will take about 45 minutes. If you have any questions, please write them in the chat or to our email. We will select the most interesting ones and discuss them with the Professor Browne at the end of his presentation. Not answered questions will be answered later and published on the SULPITER website. You are kindly asked to answer to a brief satisfaction questionnaire after the webinar. We will send you an email with the instructions. This webinar is recorded and will be available on our website along with the material in PDF. So, Professor Browne, the floor is yours.
Okay. Right. Well, thank you very much, Giuseppe, for the introduction, and thank you very much to everybody who's connected to the webinar. I think for some of you it's maybe some time difference, so that's even more impressive. I remember once I was giving a webinar when if you like, the people listening were in Australia and I was in Britain, so that's quite a severe time difference. So I got up at 4 in the morning to do that. And I don't think they realized I still had my pajamas on. But anyway, for me, it's a nice time here. It's 2 in the afternoon, and I hope it's not too terrible, whatever time difference you're facing. And very welcome to this webinar. I want to say a big thank you to the SULPITER project for dealing with this topic, because I think this topic is really, really important. And I think it's great that they're paying so much attention to this subject. And I think that I'm very happy that they're producing a lot of good work on this, that they're producing a lot of material that's available. And I think that I've been involved in urban freight for quite some time, and I've been involved in freight partnerships of different sorts for at least the last 10 years or so. And so I think we're at a really important point where we need to support the freight partnership concept and try and come up with clever ways to work together. And I think that the initiative of SULPITER in doing that is really encouraging and a really good thing. So I want to contribute to that with some thoughts about freight quality partnerships and really set in the context of engagement. How do we engage with the people who need to know about freight transport and logistics in the city, but maybe sometimes they're not sure that they need to know about it. So maybe sometimes they're not even sure that they should be engaged. And so for me, that's one of the puzzles that I hope we can talk a little bit about this afternoon and share some good ideas about, both in the presentation, but also in the discussion and the chat afterwards. Now I want to start my presentation just by acknowledging the role of colleagues that I've worked with on this topic of freight networks, freight partnerships, and engagement generally. And I think for those of you who are quite well experienced in this field, these names will be familiar to you. Well, at least two of them, I think, because I'm sure many of you know Maria Lindholm, from Closer in Gothenburg and previously with Chalmers University, and Julian Allen, a colleague of mine at University of Westminster. And I think I was there for slightly more than 20 years, but anyway, it went very fast. So I would like to acknowledge Julian's input to a lot of the research that we did there. And then a colleague who is perhaps new name to you, Elena Bretmo, a colleague of mine who's doing her PhD here at the University of Gothenburg, who's looking not just at these partnerships, but at many of the organizations which are not part of the logistics chain, but which actually influence the way urban freight and urban logistics is managed in cities. And I think I'd just like to do that before I actually start with the presentation, because their ideas and discussions and their thinking about research have been very important to me in shaping my view about what I think about urban freight partnerships and about the whole question about city logistics in that sense. Well, I know it's good to have some kind of agenda for this, and here's roughly the structure. As Giuseppe said, I will speak for maybe 40 minutes or something around that time. I think it's quite hard work listening on here. It's also a little bit odd in webinars because you don't have any, well, there's no immediate audience. So I think 45 minutes is certainly enough for that. But I want to give a small snapshot of the background. And then I really want to focus very much on freight partnerships, thinking about what we can learn from what we already know, what don't we know, what works, what doesn't work. And I want to make the important point that a freight network, a freight partnership in an urban context or a regional context is usually just one of a lot of different networks and partnerships that are happening around us. So we need to think about that when we think about how to position and how to promote the idea of a freight network or a freight quality partnership. I'm going to, just before the end, sum up with some personal reflections. They represent just my views based on researching this area for quite a long time, and also coming up now for just over 10 years of having chaired the Central London Freight Quality Partnership. And obviously over that time I've had a lot of ideas and a lot of thoughts and a lot of things I'd like to do, and I want to just sum some of that up for you before coming to some kind of conclusion at the end of it. Okay, in terms of the background, any of us who are working in this field at the moment, we're incredibly fortunate because the city is the center of so much attention. You know, when you were working in this field sort of 15 years ago or so, it was very specialized, the idea of logistics and the city. A few people were interested in it. Everybody would sometimes, you could get people to say it was important, but people didn't spend enough time thinking about it. But what we've seen is this dramatic change in the vision of the city and the importance of the city, and the way cities and the regions that are around them are seen now in sort of being so essential to welfare, so essential in terms of improvement and the need for more livability. And part of that's driven by this challenge of urbanization and city growth that's happening and that's going to continue to happen. So more people, more flows of goods, more problems if we don't take action and solve some of these things. And in all of that, I think it's very important that we focus on the urban system, on questions about design in the city, and freight and logistics alongside personal mobility. And that's why I'm particularly pleased on reading a lot of the SULPITER information in the way that they set, for example, sustainable urban logistics planning and the freight partnerships in context with sustainable urban mobility planning and joining things together. And I think this ability to join things up is something that we're going to have to get a lot better at doing, and we're going to have to focus at it a bit more. And I think these things, all of these things, these changes, they're going to be very demanding. Here are some images of the city which are sort of inspirational, colourful, lively, everything, a lot of going on. But the other side of the city can be that things that don't work, congestion, health, air quality problems. And we have to use this excitement, and we have to use this period that we're in to create a much bigger interest in the logistics importance of what's happening in the urban area. And to some extent, we're supported in that because a lot of funding is now going into this area, and the Volvo Research and Education Foundation have played their part in that by supporting urban freight initiatives at a wide geographical spread of these through centres of excellence, and an initiative here which we've called the Urban Freight Platform in Gothenburg, to work together with colleagues in Sweden and in other Scandinavian countries, and obviously to play our part in the network. And that's why I think projects like SULPITER, which bring people together from different regions, different areas, they're very important, because we've all got a lot to contribute, but we've also, all of us, got a lot to learn from each other. And I think if we can find ways to share that, then that's a really a big success in terms of what we can do. Now, as part of this Volvo initiative, some work was done to try to promote the idea of getting a better understanding of why goods movement is important, why it matters, and some of the things that we can do about it. And last year, a report was produced with that title, Why Goods Movement Matters. And for many of you joining in today on the webinar, this document, when you look at it, you'll say, well, we know that. We know some of that. And this document's not aimed in a sense that the experts who already know what needs to be done. It's aimed more at people who would be interested to know more about it and who we could influence. So I think this idea of trying to connect the experts to everybody else who's interested in the area but isn't sure what to do about it. I saw a lot of very good information in the SULPITER documents that Giuseppe sent me prior to this webinar. And this document from the VREF is another example of that. And in the document, they make the important point that we have to see the city in the context. And by context, by seeing the city in connection with the other flows and networks that exist around the city, the region, the role of the city as a gateway, the importance of the city as an origin point, but obviously in many cases a destination point. And seeing the city in the context of its region is important when we think about things like mode questions, when we think about infrastructure investment, and when we think about waste management. So it's very important to see the city in its full, if you like, context and fully within the regional setting that applies to it. But we know that many of the biggest challenges tend to come to the surface when we look more closely into the city, more towards the centres of cities or towards those parts of the cities where we can see a lot of economic activity. And there we can say that perhaps the big challenge is to find enough space. And having found space, another big challenge becomes allocation and use of the space, how to share space in the city. And I think the sharing of space in the city and the sharing of ideas about the sharing of space, that's a very important role for a freight partnership. And so how to solve very difficult puzzles, if you like, in terms of priorities, allocation, and working together in order to achieve that. Those are things that I think really matter from a freight partnership point of view. And I want to say a little bit about those things. So, of course, there are lots of challenges at the moment. Technology doesn't stand still, far from it. and it's affecting how we think and manage in terms of the city. A lot of you have thought about being involved in discussing with your colleagues things like autonomous vehicles, for instance. That's going to be a big change in the way we think about the city in the future. We can think about innovation in terms of urban space. What can we do about changing the time and the space, the use of the space during different times, for example? We can think about the way that goods movement and personal mobility come closer together in many ways. The growth of e-commerce, the growing importance of trying to reduce car use, all of these things show the linkages between logistics approaches and systems thinking, and the need to understand that in the mobility context. So we need to work together, and we need to widen the participation. It has to go beyond those who are already expert in urban freight and urban logistics. We have to get much more involved with people who are planning, designing, working in a technology field. We need to get them much more engaged in the whole question about how to deal with the challenge of urban freight, urban logistics. So one of the steps to that is clearly about how to engage with people. And when we say that, I think we can think about public authorities particularly, who need to engage and who have, in many cases, had a role that's primarily focused around regulation, the regulation of time, the regulation of vehicles by size, by type, by roads that they're allowed to use. And we know that this focus on regulation can lead to some problems of confrontation between the regulator and the organizations being regulated. We know that it often leads to disagreement, maybe sometimes to sub-optimization. We've seen examples where a vehicle restriction by size results in 2 smaller vehicles replacing 1 larger vehicle. Maybe that's okay, but that's also not ideal from the point of view of congestion. So we need to find ways to engage better in working with people whose viewpoints often are not aligned. They don't have necessarily a shared vision, and that's one of the big challenges about how to make the vision a bit more shared in that sense. So part of that role is to increase awareness of urban logistics, and part of the role of that is to increase awareness among those in urban logistics about the needs of other people planning and working in the city for a complicated range of different goals and different needs. So freight policy is important, and one of the roles for a freight network and a freight partnership is to improve the understanding of the freight and logistics activity. What's the role of that in a city? This is a huge important area in terms of the economic vitality of cities, and we need to articulate that, and we need to make examples of where it's working well, and we need to be honest about the places where it's not working so well and think about trying to solve some of those problems. Very important to work with the private sector, as well as the question of getting the public sector and the regulatory bodies involved. And of course, that means things like sharing good ideas, disseminating good practices, and thinking about how we actually implement some of the things that we need to do if we're really going to affect a change in the environment. And there are lots of different types of stakeholder engagement that we could sort of discuss and that many of you will have thought about and be familiar with. So many public-private partnerships that exist, sometimes for very specific reasons, to overcome a funding challenge or for a specific initiative. Also the idea of exchanges between peer-to-peer exchanges, the idea of exchanging knowledge with colleagues from the same role as you play, but in a different place. Because one of the challenges for urban freight has been the question of whether these initiatives and solutions and implementations, to what extent are they place specific, or can we translate a good idea from one place to another? We're working at the moment in a project called City Lab, led by Toy in Norway, and in that project it's about looking at different implementations in different cities and seeing what we can learn and share about those, and which of those ideas can be scaled up. And one of those ways of scaling something up and spreading the information has been through the freight partnerships that exist in some of those cities, and working with the local freight partnership to actually think about that. So local freight networks, business improvement districts, freight charters, there are lots of different types of stakeholder engagement, and we need to accept that this is good on the one hand, many different ways that we can engage, but it's also sometimes tricky because there are many ways we can engage, and we have to engage at many different levels. And yet the number of people working in urban freight and urban logistics is still really quite small, despite the growth in interest that we've seen. So it's not easy to engage with all these stakeholder groups all at the same time. I already mentioned this. In the public side, we can see cities, districts, traffic departments, planning authorities, regulators, lots of different areas. And in the private sector, the list is very long. Shippers, the senders of things, the carriers, the third-party logistics companies, and importantly, the receivers. Now, traditionally, the receivers, we could say, well, that's a business. That's that's a retail unit, an office unit, maybe an industrial unit. Of course, what we can see now with the rise of e-commerce is that residential buildings are becoming major receivers of freight flows, and they're playing part of the logistics picture, if you like. And we have to think about this whole question of receivers and the location of these receivers and how they are or are not engaging with the discussion about freight and logistics flows in the city. Another group who are very significant here are going to be property owners. They've started to think about this a lot more, but in the next few years we're going to see many more of them becoming much more engaged in this topic. Okay, so freight partnerships. Let's talk a bit about that. And Giuseppe already defined it, often seen as a kind of ideally a long-term partnership between the stakeholders involved with freight and logistics planning that either formally or informally meets to discuss and find solutions to problems and issues that occur. Now, it is most frequently been written about in an urban context, but actually, as the work done by the group SULPITER have shown, we can see different scales to some of these partnerships. And I know that in the document that they've produced, they've also found examples of partnerships which are not actually within a city, but maybe in an area that functions between cities. And I think that's something we'll come back to at the end. What's the right scale for the partnership? And I can tell you the answer to that now. There isn't a single right scale for the partnership. The partnership has to fit the purposes for which it's intended. So we can think about this question of scale, but it's tricky to have a rule about it. So partnership about meeting, discussing, finding solutions, and the degree of formality, well, that depends on the people who form the partnership. Now here I'm going to turn to a small survey that I did with Maria Lindholm and talk a bit about some insights that we gained from a survey where we looked at some freight partnerships in different countries which were functioning in somewhat different ways. And we produced a small report about that a couple of years ago. Now in that report, we wanted to compare the different approaches because there are many of these partnerships. They go under different names, and it's interesting to think a little bit about different ways that they can work together to share their ideas. We wanted to think about what was similar and what was different, and we wanted to think about the things that worked and also to talk a bit about the things that didn't work. This was a small-scale survey. We had a lot of help from people in different networks, whether that's the World Conference on Transport Research, Transportation Research Board, Institute of City Logistics, and the Volvo Research and Education Foundation networks. So for any of you who've connected up today, if you completed a questionnaire, we appreciate it. And for any of you who are connected today and interested in freight partnerships, if you get a questionnaire in the future, I hope you'll complete it. So do your bit for bringing knowledge to this field of freight partnerships. We had answers from a range of different countries, but of course it's, how can I say, a scatter of places really, and we can't say it's in any sense representative of particular geographical areas, and nor is it sufficiently widespread. So I saw just coming up on the thing, WCTRS, that's the World Conference for Transportation Research Society. They're running networks, and they create a conference every 3 years. And the ICL is the Institute of City Logistics. Again, a group of people, academics mainly, meeting together every second year to discuss logistics problems and challenges. We had support from those groups, and as a result, we were able to get some insights into a number of different freight partnerships in different locations. And here are some of the ones that we had, and you can see that they're quite widespread. They're in very different sized cities. They're functioning in quite different ways in some cases. Some coming more from the public authority side, some coming from a mixture of public and private, and some really looking much more at sort of particular problems rather than the broad problems that they might face in a particular city or a city region. So very varied, and some useful insights that could be captured from that. And these are the kind of things that we were interested in finding out about. What kind of objectives do these partnerships have? What's the kind of range of stakeholders involved, and to what extent is there engagement with the political level? Because clearly engagement with policy in an urban context is a complicated picture. Politicians are interested in finding solutions, and that's important in terms of how we engage. And in urban freight and urban logistics, it can be difficult sometimes to find simple solutions. The problems are complicated. They often need a complicated set of actions. So finding easy solutions can be difficult, which means political engagement can also be sometimes difficult. We wanted to know how they were run. Did they have a vision, a plan? Did they have the same participants attending? How did they manage projects? And we wanted to know some of the outcomes that they could share. How did they, what did they consider to be important, useful, meaningful outcomes from the work that they were doing? So in the survey, we looked at things like when the partnership was initiated, who started it, why, what kind of partner managed it, how was it supported and funded, who took part in the meetings, how many meetings were held, what kind of status did the partnership have? Was it a decision-making body? Did it have the support of the local transport authority in whatever way that was encompassed in the city? What were some of the outcomes? And then very importantly, what were some of the strengths and weaknesses of the partnership? Okay, well, we know that this was some of the reasons that people gave for some of this, the motivation, for example, of why create a partnership. Well, clearly a lot of the reason is that there's an awareness out there that we need to interact between the public authority at the city level, the public authority at a district level, the public authority beyond that. We need to interact between the public authority and the private sector. We also know that we need to find a way to take a long-term perspective, not just looking at problems one by one, but linking the problems together and understanding how learning in one field can be applied and used in another area. The idea of discussing and sharing information about these problems and the possibilities is important, and accepting that there's some complexity and trying to share a better view between those in the public and private sector was underlined or underpinned part of the motivation to create these partnerships. And in the partnerships, you can find many different kinds of organizations from different backgrounds involved. Freight transport ones like freight forwarders, local authorities and city authorities, carriers and the associations that represent them, trade associations, transport operators, retailers, property owners, and then importantly, universities and researchers, because universities working in this field of urban freight and urban logistics have been very active in connecting with practitioners and policymakers, and in doing that, they've played an interesting role in some of these partnerships, and I'll say a little bit more about that when I come to the end and make some personal reflections on it. And all kinds of topics are on the agenda, topics that range from policy at an urban level through to policy at a street level, through to design at a street level. The question of how to share the street space. I know that in the US you have a concept of complete streets. This kind of sharing and how we use the street space is very, very important, and something that it's essential that those people engaged in freight transport and logistics discussions get involved in. But there are other initiatives. Electric vehicles in cities have become very much higher up the agenda. the challenge of what happens when we allocate space for different uses. For example, if we allocate part of the road network for cycle lanes, someone's gained, but it's argued that sometimes somebody has lost in terms of access to the curbside or capacity on the road network. Events, major events in cities, and then terminals, infrastructure planning, all these kind of planning and space-related questions. These form these kind of topics that are discussed by many of these partnerships. So just to emphasize, no single right mix of people or organizations involved, and a wide range of topics that we could expect to find on the agenda for a freight partnership or freight quality partnership. Some examples of what they do, we could maybe break them down into physical outputs and maybe softer outputs. And in the physical outputs, we can think of some examples to do with pilot projects, so testing something in an urban freight context, maybe looking at information sharing, whether that be a question of how to get the best route through the city, or signing and giving information to those who need it in order to avoid wasting time in making their delivery trip. Question of roadmaps, maybe, especially using now interactive possibilities for that to help with routing decisions and so on. Design of space at sometimes very detailed level. One of the problems that faces in planning and designing street space is that you need to be able to understand the needs of different kinds of users, and freight is very heterogeneous, so the needs for a parcel company are very different from the needs for a company delivering larger items, which in turn will be different from somebody who maybe has hazardous or dangerous products on board. So planning and designing in detail is something where partnerships can play a very significant role, because they bring together such a range of expertise, and that can be shared with other people. More examples like allocation of space in terms of loading capacity, projects to try different things in different times of the day, information sharing about restrictions on the network, and then, as I said, the question of design. If we're going to redesign part of the street network, maybe we can think about how we should take account of the freight needs of the businesses that are on the street and the operators that deliver there. And just on that last point, the freight needs of the businesses on the street. That's a challenge, because mostly we don't capture that very well, because the transport companies who make the deliveries, they're not registered at those addresses, and often when surveys are done of the street businesses, they're not really able to articulate the questions and the answers around what needs to be done for my delivery operation. They need to connect somehow back to the carriers and the 3PL companies, and making that connection is something where a freight partnership can play an important role. And the examples go on, and if we think about the softer ones, we can think about some studies, about analysis, about collaboration through projects, and also about exchanging ideas and guidance of what's available. So for example, in the London Freight Quality Partnership where I'm involved, we have always, at the meetings, we have an update about European Union projects which people might find interesting and relevant to what they're doing, even though they're not in the projects. So SULPITER would be an example of that kind of project that we would bring to people's attention, just as would projects like Novolog, CityLab, Success, all these kind of projects which those who are involved know about, but sometimes those outside of the immediate network are less familiar with. So this idea of sharing information, sharing and exchanging what we know is very important. And the last point on that slide says informal networking between meetings, and it's kind of the last point, and it ends up a bit throwaway. But actually, if I had to pick out one of the things I think is really important about freight networks and freight partnerships, it's the building of the connections between the people that attend that really makes a difference in the long run. It's the fact that people working in the same kind of field, but in a different part of the city, know each other. That people working in different fields in the same part of the city know each other. It's those connections that these kind of partnerships can really support. And those connections, you can't force them to happen, but when they happen, they're very powerful in terms of coming up with ways to solve problems. So kind of things that work, I would say we can find examples of inputs to policy, the networking, which I just spoke about, and which I have to say I passionately believe is not just a word and not just a thing about talking with a cup of tea or whatever you want to, coffee or whatever it is. It is absolutely essential if we want to solve some of these problems. The focus on solutions to freight and logistics questions, and then cooperation, better dialogue, and better studies that take account of different perspectives, which is where a partnership can really play its role. And of course, we should be honest about this, because there are going to be some things which, are not ideally, they're not, where partnerships have trouble. And one of the areas where that's clear is that if you have a partnership with many different views, it can be difficult to reach agreement. And in fact, sometimes I think we should accept that we're not going to reach an agreement, that reaching an agreement may be beyond the scope of what we can do in a particular situation. And we need to accept that the closest we're going to get to that is a better understanding of the other person or the other group's needs and requirements about something. But reaching agreement is difficult and can be slow, and a partnership may not be always the most easy way to solve it. We could say that sometimes we lack sufficient breadth in a partnership, so technical knowledge about some things may be missing, although in a more sort of functioning and active partnerships, that kind of problem can be overcome by invitation, by knowing who to invite, by knowing how to go into this problem. We sometimes see a lack of participation from some sectors, and that's a challenge for freight and logistics, because it's not always the case that those who influence the decisions know how important they are in influencing the decisions, and sometimes they're not willing necessarily to give up the time to take part in those areas to deal with it. And of course, resources are always a question. Do we have enough resources in terms of what we can do for within the partnership? Okay, so we could say that things that work well and things that could perhaps work even better works well because people want to improve things, works well because we have a focus on what's possible, works well when we have good organization and someone chairing the network and being active in that way, but maybe doesn't work so well when we have people who come to one meeting but then skip a few meetings, so they lose the, they lose the sort of momentum of being a group working on the same problems and the same questions. It can be a problem sometimes to disseminate all the good ideas that come from these networks and these partnerships. Sometimes there are excellent ideas captured, but where's the dissemination channel? How do we get that message across to people? And then the tendency for people to say, well, if we don't make decisions and we don't implement projects, maybe this is just a way of talking. I have a reaction to that, which is to say that sometimes it seems to me that talking is pretty important, actually. And I'm not sure I see too much talking. Yes, I see a lack of action sometimes, but sometimes the lack of action isn't following the lack of talking. It's just there's a lack of action. And actually, to think about talking together and talking in a better way, I'd say that's a pretty important thing to do if we want to solve problems in cities or in other urban and suburban spaces. Some of these ideas were summed up in a Volvo Research and Education Foundation research brief on organizing and managing freight partnerships, and the detailed guidance that SULPITER have put together with Giuseppe and colleagues. That's a very, that's obviously a lot of depth in that about how to do different things and so on. Okay, let me move on to sort of what I'm going to go fairly quickly through so that we can get the presentation out of the way and you can ask some questions about it. Let me just move very quickly to the relevance of other networks, because actually I think freight quality partnerships are very important, but they need to find ways to interact with other networks. And I've picked a couple of those to talk about here. the two I've picked to talk about are business improvement districts and town centre management organisations. Now, these are not found in all countries or cities in the world, but something like them is found in many cities. So business improvement districts, which is an idea that came from the United States, are very important in many cities. They're directly funded by business. They are created as a result of a vote among the business ratepayers or taxpayers in a specific geographical location within the city, and they can be very important in influencing what happens in their local part of the city. Traditionally, they focused on things like increasing revenue by getting more footfall of customers and others, people to come to the location. They focused on maybe security and safety questions, and they focused on sort of general travel promotions. They have not traditionally focused on freight transport and logistics. And that's where there's an important connection between a freight partnership and a business improvement district, because actually working together with a business improvement district can be very productive in terms of making change. The same applies to the question of town centre management organisations, maybe more diverse and less structured than a business improvement district, but their role also includes promoting the local area, includes thinking about improvements that they could maybe make the area more attractive or livable, more relevant to visitors. And obviously, when you think about some of those things, attractive, livable, better for visitors, then freight transport plays a part positively, and it has to be acknowledged negatively sometimes, in that interaction in those areas. And these type of organizations are very important intermediaries between public and private sectors. They promote place, they can mediate between the councils and the authorities, and they work with businesses to reduce, typically to focus on cost reductions like joint procurement planning, but increasingly they're thinking about questions around urban freight deliveries and urban logistics improvements. And we've reviewed, with colleagues, I've reviewed activities in relation to London, New York and Gothenburg, and I want to say just a few words about each of those places. Well, let's start in New York. This is a snapshot or a screenshot, sorry, of what happens when you look at the New York City bid webpage. You find many of these business improvement districts. And if you look to a map of these, you can see that they're spread around the city. They're very dense in the Manhattan area here, and it shows just how significant that must be in terms of the space and the activity that happens in such a dense and vibrant economic space, as we're talking about in the heart of a city like New York. In New York, we've been helped a lot by the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, or RPI. Those of you who are working in urban freight will know Jose Holguin-Beras very well and his colleagues, and they've been very active in the urban freight side, leading on things like off-hour deliveries, which was an initiative which they've worked very hard at in New York, with a lot of help and support, and working together with the city authorities there about that. And in some of their work, they've noted this feature that, well, business improvement districts recognize freight, but it's not something that they seek actively to engage in necessarily. But what they've noticed is a change over time, with more businesses in business improvement districts wanting to get involved, and more people thinking about how to make that active and meaningful. And these business improvement districts have supported initiatives in New York City through the industry advisory groups, and providing, if you like, a channel and a way of activity, a way of actioning some of the good ideas that come out of research and out of policymaker initiatives in different urban areas. These kind of advisory groups made up of big organizations. Obviously, they have power to change things in their own networks, and also to change things by working together on different problems. Okay, I'm going to skip to London here. The slides will all be available, so there's going to be a kind of a couple of things I might go through. If I'm too fast, they'll be in the slide set at the end. In London, you can see again the pattern of a lot of business improvement districts here, and I want to focus maybe on the one in the centre here. That's the New West End company, right in the centre of London. The New West End company is responsible for three main streets, Bond Street, Oxford Street, and Regent Street. So these are very, very busy, important retail streets, but also very important from a business perspective, because the buildings above the retailing space are very often used for office space and commercial use. So it's a very busy and economically important part of London in that sense. The Business Improvement District in the West End wants to make the area more attractive, has a goal to make it the world's top shopping destination, promoting the area, funding public realm improvements, making it a nicer space to be in that sense. And traditionally, they didn't have a great connection with freight and logistics, although the city, that part of London depends on good freight and logistics, and also is very challenged by freight and logistics activities. But if you look at some of the recent initiatives that they've been taking, then you can see the way that they have a power to change things. So the new West End Company, which represents one of the biggest bids in London, one of the most important in terms of the scale of the activities, two initiatives among many that they've introduced. One about supplier consolidation in the waste field, whereby changing the way they make contracts for waste among their members, they're able to reduce vehicle movements by up to 95% in some of those streets. And then delivery consolidation, where again, by getting the receivers, or in this case, the retailers in Regent Street, to join together, they can use an electric vehicle, they can consolidate loads, and now they're thinking how to roll that out across London to other networks, other places. And then turning to Gothenburg, which I guess is a city that probably most people who've connected to the webinar would be less familiar with than New York and London, but you know, it's good to have different examples at different scales here. Gothenburg in the west of Sweden. If we look into the city centre, which is marked on the right-hand side here, that's an area of about 2.5 kilometres by 2 kilometres, maybe something like that. A relatively small city, but active, very important in terms of the businesses there. Then here we have a city centre management organisation called Innerstaden, and Innerstaden is bringing together the businesses that are in the heart of the city and the oldest part of the city, and making all kinds of initiatives, again often to do with placemaking, but also increasingly involved in things like urban logistics activities. So in the centre of Gothenburg, there's an initiative called Stadsleveransen, and I apologize to anybody who's from Sweden or another Scandinavian country for my accent in pronouncing that, but this is a small delivery vehicle shown in the bottom right, and this is very much supported and promoted by Innerstaden. So they're playing a role in making things change in the city in terms of what they want to see happening in that area. Okay, I'm conscious of the time, and I wanted to maybe make some personal reflections on the Central London Freight Quality Partnership and then wind up. So I'm planning to finish within the next, certainly within the next 5 minutes. Okay, so I've participated in the Central London Freight Partnership since 2006. And I've actually chaired it since then. So I was a professor in the University of Westminster, as Giuseppe said at the beginning, and I was very pleased and very proud to be asked to chair it in 2006, and I've carried on doing that. It was established with help from Transport for London, brought together public and private sector organisations, the boroughs in central London, or the districts or arrondissements. And it includes these central London boroughs here: Camden, City of London, City of Westminster, Islington, Kensington and Chelsea, Lambeth and Southwark, together with a whole range of trade associations and companies. And here's a list of some of those organisations. Some of them will be names that you would be familiar with, I guess, in terms of some of these transport and third-party logistics companies like DHL. Others will be very specific to London. So the John Lewis Partnership, which is a UK retail chain, Travis Perkins, a building a company providing construction items to businesses, and then importantly, these associations and institutes who represent managers and different businesses at a different level and provide a very important networking function beyond the freight network. So another way to get the message out to people through these associations and institutes, and another way to get information in through the associations and institutes. For example, you can't talk to all the small businesses in London as a freight quality partnership, but you can talk to the Federation of Small Businesses and their message will go out in terms of their connection to their members. So the aim was to develop a vision, increase understanding, think about the kind of solutions that can be brought to bear, and then look at good practices and how to network and build connections between the different partners. And in a sense, here's my reflection on what I think some of the strengths of the partnerships, based on what I've seen over the 10 years of being the chair of the Central London Partnership and looking at across at other partnerships as well. I think there's major strengths in dialogue, in understanding and increasing the knowledge of what happens as a result of these partnerships. I think the structure is very important. I think a partnership that doesn't involve good interaction and therefore some kind of balance between the public and private sectors is less effective in terms of influencing change and influencing what will happen. I think achieving change actually nearly always requires some kind of top-down and bottom-up approach. Top-down in the sense that people at the top of organizations will commit to something about the change, but bottom-up in the sense that you have to have people who are capable of carrying out the either operational or planning change. It's no good the chief executive of something, whether it be a public authority or a private company, saying, oh, this is ideal, we want to change this, we're going to have a new way of looking at the streets in the middle of central London. If the people who work on actually redesigning the streets don't have the capabilities to do that and take account of the diverse needs of those people using it. So that top down and bottom up, and the freight partnership has to play a role in supporting those two levels of interaction, I think. I think it's essential to get freight and logistics into strategic planning, and that is very easy to write down on a PowerPoint slide and very difficult to do, but it's getting better. Freight and logistics activities in cities are getting much more featured in strategic planning than they were 10 years ago. So we should be very heartened by that, and we should make sure we make as much effort as we can to keep on with that problem, that challenge. I would say maybe don't pick the most difficult problem first, because people like to see some solutions. But on the other hand, there will be difficult problems and difficult discussions and sometimes disagreements. To some extent, of course, this is affected by the style of discussion and debate in different countries and in different types of industry and business and so on. But we shouldn't be afraid of some disagreement. We have to accept the disagreement and find ways to bring things closer together. And sometimes ways to do that appear unexpectedly. So thinking about events and timing and when things happen, they can be very significant in terms of changing the way people look at other people's point of view. We need to think about the right level of participation, and we need to practice at engagement. You know, it's easy again to write down engagement, but actually you've got to keep asking people and keep involving people and keep finding reasons why they should attend and keep making sure that they do attend and that they get something from it. Okay, so to wind up, freight partnerships can play a strong role in the uptake of these initiatives that I've talked about and that I think many of you calling in today will be familiar about. There are many networks. The freight network concept or the freight quality partnership concept doesn't replace these existing networks. It needs to connect to them, and we need to understand the overlap and the connections between the different networks. Making decisions varies a lot among the freight partnerships, which Maria Lindholm and I looked at together, and it is difficult in some circumstances where people have to agree to disagree, but in others it maybe can be simpler to make a decision depending on the structure of the partnership. I think in the past we've seen a heavy reliance on engagement with carriers, If you tell the transport operators what to do, well, that will be fine. But let's be clear about this. The transport operator is just one part of the picture. They need to respond to their customer. They need to think about the landowner. They need to think about the people who use the space in the city. They need to think about their part of the activity in the context of other users. And we need to find ways to engage with a wide range of people. And that's where the freight partnership is important. Freight and logistics experience is still not the majority. It's not embedded in the majority of public sector bodies who deal with urban planning and urban transport questions. So freight partnerships can be important in that way. And by doing this, we can make better use of the existing initiatives and the existing projects that we have. These are important channels to get the message out about projects which deliver very good lessons, very good things we can learn about, but which stay confined to a small group of people who know something about the projects. So getting this message across is important. I'm encouraged to see the SULPITER guidance that's available from the project here, and that's why I was happy to take part in the discussion today with everybody. I just want to end by saying that, I think change will only happen if we find ways to work together. I think it is absolutely essential to do that. And these are all people I've worked with who influenced and helped me to think about urban freight as I think about it when I'm sort of thinking about making a presentation or making a plan, or when I think about chairing the Central London Freight Quality Partnership. We have to support each other. We have to get good at sharing ideas, and all of those people and many others have helped me in doing that. So I'd like to sort of acknowledge their input. And I'd like to finish, having overrun a little bit here, by just saying thank you very much for the invitation to take part from Giuseppe and colleagues, Eleonora and others. And thank you very much for connecting to the webinar and taking part. I've seen a lot of comments coming up, and I'm going to hand back to Giuseppe to bring it to the, to deal with the last part of the webinar. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Professor Browne, for this interesting lesson and this training. We collected a lot of questions. We'll leave you some time to take a glass of water after 40 minutes of presentation. And we collected some questions. I introduced my colleague Eleonora too, which
Good afternoon, everyone.
Is here with me and with other 8 colleagues which followed with us this interesting lesson.
All right, so again, thank you all very much for joining this webinar. Just if some of you may have missed it, we are collecting questions through the chat or through email, and we're going to try our best to answer to all of them. So I'm going to ask Professor Mike Browne some of the main questions that we collected today and also in the past days from our partnership. So I would like to start off by asking a few questions on how to set up a free quality partnership in practice. So some of the questions that we got are mainly related to the time scale of FQP. So how long should it run for? What's the frequency? So how many times a year should meetings be held? But also we got a question from the chat talking about whether elections may influence or affect quality partnership.
Yeah, okay, I think those are very good questions. And that's often a sort of kind of a very British way of saying that they're hard to answer, actually. But okay, I think to set one up, that's a bit variable. I know that in the case of London, although it was established in 2006, for about 18 months before then, a small group had been talking together about what sort of a partnership they should have and how would they do it. So there it took some time to set up. I think it depends on the scale of the city and the scale of the area that you're interested in dealing with. But I think you can set something up which could start quite small, but with the aim of growing and increasing the number of members. I think I'd like to add a question to the questions you mentioned, because I think another question people often ask is how many members should there be? And I think there's maybe no obvious answer to that. In London, we've decided over time to have sometimes two types of meetings. One which we call a current freight interest group, issues group meeting, where we make a very open invitation, and then sometimes a smaller meeting. But very often we found that actually we don't need to do that, because the number of people seems to work out at around 25 or so, and that number's perfectly manageable and can have a very good discussion, and seems to just by natural be naturally a reasonable number of people to represent different views and have different perspectives. I think it's important to meet frequently enough that people can see the momentum of comments and actions from one meeting to another. So I think looking across the surveys we had, meeting 4 times a year was a very common kind of cycle. Could be more a little bit, could be less. And how long they would run for is another good question, because I think some have been created to solve a particular problem. So they were created and then, in a sense, having done their job, they stopped. But others have a much more ongoing role, which is all about maintaining this network and putting freight on the agenda for those organizations and those people in a different part of the network who don't necessarily understand why freight's important, or maybe do understand that freight's important, but don't have the connections to go to the next stage. And in terms of the election cycle, I think actually it's very important to have something like a partnership to push beyond the question of the election cycles, because freight and logistics is more important than an election cycle. And we have to find a way to interact with the difficult political decisions that are made when we have change, but we have to do that as freight and logistics researchers, policymakers, decision makers, and those who rely on them. We have to do that beyond the election time. So I'd say we shouldn't focus it just on the election cycles. We need to think of ways always to go beyond that, and that's why we should be wary about. I don't see any reason why they should be policy focused, but not politically focused, would be how I would see it. Sorry, that was quite a long answer. I apologize for that.
That's all right. Thank you. Actually, talking about keeping the FQP going and stakeholders involved as well, we were wondering what is the main motivation, the driving force that will bring people together. And actually, this is also a question that we got from our participants. If you have a specific example of an issue that motivated partners to engage in a free quality partnership, and if this worked well at the end.
Yeah, that's, I think, a good point. And I mean, problems bring people together, actually. Things that are difficult bring people together. And the hard part about that is that if there's a problem and there's a lack of understanding between a public, let's say a public side, a public sector side, public authority side, and the business community, coming together to discuss that problem can be quite hard. And that's why the role of mediation or chairing, I think, is important in this. So having somebody who is committed to the partnership, or not one person, but maybe a small core group who are committed to the partnership in a very wholehearted way, I think really matters, because to get people to come, you have to deal with difficult questions, and you have to provide people with something that's worth attending for. And that could be actions, solving problems, but it could also be information. Here's information that you don't know about without being part of this network. And it could also, I believe, very importantly, being the connection to the other members of the network. So I think 3 things keep people coming: problems, where they see some progress being made and the willingness to debate difficult things, information and sharing of that information, and then the networks and the building of the links which go way beyond and outside of the meetings that the Freight Partnership holds.
Okay, thank you. So as you know, SULPITER as a project is dealing with city logistics at functional urban area level. So we were wondering, as a partnership, because there are some of our partners joining today, if you have any suggestion for dealing with free quality partnership at a FUA level instead of city level. So, for example, do you think it's a good idea to have a group for city logistics and one for wider areas, or should they be together?
Yes, that's a hard question actually. It's hard because cities, the structure of cities and urban areas is so diverse. So, for instance, in London, it makes sense to have a central London focus for a partnership because the particular problems that face freight and logistics activities in central London are somewhat different to the questions that face those people in the outer London area, where maybe you have a lot of distribution centres in a location, but not a lot of other activities. So I think that the size of the type of network and the size of the network does need to be adjusted according to the characteristics of the urban space of the space we're talking about, which might be a highly urbanized space, or could be a less urban space. For example, as you get nearer to port activities, you don't find the same degree of other land use, of residential and other commercial use, and yet we still probably have freight and logistics questions that need to be discussed out there. So I'm not trying to duck the question, but what I think is really important is to think hard about what kind of partnership works for the different sorts of areas. But for instance, in central London, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to have one to deal with, let's say, logistics, and another one to talk only maybe about construction. So maybe it makes sense to bring these things together when they're trying to share the same space and when they're dealing with some of the same decision makers certainly on the public side. Sorry, it wasn't a especially good answer to the question, but it was my best. The best I could do.
Thank you. I understand questions can be very challenging at times.
Yeah.
So I hope this one is going to be somehow easier.
Okay.
Actually, you mentioned a couple of trends that could affect free quality partnerships and generally the relationship between stakeholders in terms of city logistics. Well, among the different trends that you mentioned e-commerce. E-commerce is booming, and we know that many cities are affected by this trend as well. So, what about the impacts for cities, and which instrument do you think policymakers should be using to tackle this problem?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two slightly different questions in that. One is my opinion as a researcher about how we should deal with e-commerce trends, and the other one is what should a freight partnership maybe get involved in doing. So I want to take the second question first. I mean, I've seen in London quite a bit of interest among the members of the freight partnership in terms of what's happening to this change in e-commerce, because in London it's argued that many people have decided to have products delivered to the office rather than delivered to their home address. And so one of the actions that's been taken there has been for some of these business improvement districts, which I mentioned, and an organisation that is a sort of umbrella for that called the Cross River Partnership. They've put a lot of effort into helping people to find alternatives to having the item delivered to their work address. So in a sense, by doing that, they're then taking pressure off the network within the centre of London and saying, well, you could have it delivered somewhere else, or there could be different arrangements. So I think freight partnerships have a role to play in that, probably in terms of sharing information about the alternatives to different delivery options. So that's, I guess, their main role, and looking at good practice. In terms of what cities should do about e-commerce, well, I think we still need more data on some of this, which is a typical researcher's answer to the sort of problem. But the difficulty is that different patterns of e-commerce result in very different trips being made. So e-commerce and the rise of grocery deliveries is very different to the rise in terms of shopping for clothing which fits through the parcels network, for example. So we need to disaggregate some of these flows, and then we need to think about the kind of policies that could lead to better use of the vehicles making these delivery trips, and importantly, how we could maybe ensure that we had higher levels of efficiency in the actual operation of the delivery to the home, or perhaps more often giving more options to people so that they could have it delivered to a collection point or to somewhere else that's also convenient for them.
All right. So just one final question. So one of our partners was very interested in understanding how to raise awareness among stakeholders, particularly how to go beyond their own business interests and sort of small day-to-day issue in urban freight distribution. So basically, I guess the question would be, how can you open the discussion within an FQP to a wider time horizon and sort of issues from a wider perspective?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to think about. I remember that when I started chairing the Central London Freight Quality Partnership, there was a very big issue that I was not particularly familiar with because I was not from working in, although I worked in this field, it wasn't something that affected me directly, and that was the way that companies were fined or penalized with a charge for parking in the wrong place when they made a delivery. And this was something that made people very angry because they felt, well, I'm being fined for doing my job. And it was a very, in a sense, a potentially short-term question, which brought people, if you like, to the table. Now, over time, that problem still exists, but in different periods it's been solved, and then it's come back a little bit, and then solved, and then it's come back a little bit. So a short-term problem brought people to the table, in some ways, you could say, but they've carried on coming to the table because they are interested in helping and being part of the longer-term future of the city. And I think most places are not so, okay, no place is the same as another place, but that kind of thing where they have short-term problems, but they want in the long term, they want to play their part in making the city work effectively. I think we can find that out in different places. So I think the person who asked the question, let's look for some examples from freight partnerships where we get people engaged because there's a short-term problem. I gave one, and they stay engaged because there's a long-term question. There is not enough space to go around, and we're going to have to find ways to allocate and discuss the use of the space. That's an ongoing problem, and people should want to keep discussing that, I'm sure, in the future.
So time has gone. So we would like to thank you, all our colleagues from also from other projects like Novelog, Success, Support, and Reform, which shared this information. We would like to say thank you also to our colleagues from the Center of Excellence for Sustainable Urban Freight System, in particular Professor José Olguín Veras from the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute of New York, which shared this invitation around the world and made it a global event. I see also connections from Canada, Colombia, USA, and of course Europe. So it's a very, very good webinar event. So thank you also to Tomislav Letnik and Lucio Rubini and Roberta Lazzari, which are following this aspect with us in the SULPITER project. And of course, thank you to Professor Browne for this interesting training webinar. We hope you all enjoyed this training event, and we look forward to have you in the next SULPITER training webinars. Thank you, and see you next time.
Thanks, Giuseppe.